All right, let's dive into some pretty deep philosophical waters today.
Yeah, sounds exciting.
We're going to be tackling selections from Descartes' sixth meditation.
Oh, wow.
You know, where he really grapples with, like, the nature of reality itself?
The big questions.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how can we be sure that the physical world, the stuff we see and touch every day, actually exists?
Well, I think most people kind of take that for granted, right?
Yeah, I mean, I see a table, I touch it, it's got to be real, right?
Seems logical.
But Descartes, he doesn't let us off that easy.
No, he does not.
He actually starts with doubt.
Interesting.
Doubt about the very senses that we rely on to tell us what's real.
So like our sight, touch, taste, all of that.
Exactly. He wants to build knowledge from the ground up.
A firm foundation, yeah.
And for him, that means we can't just assume that our senses are always giving us the truth.
Makes sense.
So I'm curious, how does he actually convince us to doubt something that feels so, I don't know, fundamental to our experience?
Well, he points out all these situations where our senses can be tricked.
Okay, like what? Give
Okay.
me an example.
Think about those optical illusions, where two lines look like they're different lengths.
Yeah.
But then you measure them and they're actually identical.
Oh, right.
Or if you ever experience that phantom limb sensation,
Phantom limb.
where you feel like something's happening in a limb that's not even there anymore.
I'm not sure, actually.
It can happen after an amputation,
Oh, okay.
or sometimes even just when your foot falls asleep.
Oh, yeah. Like when your foot falls asleep and it feels huge even though it's obviously not actually bigger.
Exactly. Those are the kinds of examples Descartes uses.
To show that our senses aren't always reliable.
Exactly. They're not infallible.
Okay, I'm starting to see his point.
We can't just blindly trust them.
So if we can't completely trust our senses, where do we go from there? Like, how do we even begin to understand the world?
Well, this is where Descartes makes a really crucial distinction
Okay.
between the mind and the body.
The mind and the body.
Yeah, he argues that we can actually conceive of the mind without the body and vice versa.
So, like, picturing, I don't know, a soul floating around without any physical form.
Exactly. Like a ghost or a spirit.
Okay, I can kind of wrap my head around that.
And then on the flip side, you can imagine a body, like a robot or something,
Right.
existing without any consciousness or thought.
Okay, so just a purely physical machine.
Right.
So he's basically saying, because we can separate these concepts mentally, they must actually be separate things in reality.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
This mind-body distinction is kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
It's a big one.
Yeah, it's huge. And I guess that's how he eventually gets to arguing for the existence of material things, even after all this doubt about the senses.
That's where it's all leading, yeah.
Okay, so we've got the doubt, we've got this mind-body separation. What's the next piece of the puzzle?
Well, think about this. If the mind and body are distinct, how do they interact?
Oh, good question.
And for Descartes, one of the ways they connect is through the imagination.
Okay, imagination. I love a good thought experiment.
Yeah, me too. And Descartes has a lot to say about it.
I bet he does. So what's his take on imagination?
Well, first he makes a distinction between imagination and pure understanding.
Okay, so like there are different types of thinking.
Exactly. He says that imagination relies on the body in a way that pure understanding doesn't.
Give me an example.
Okay, let's see. We can both understand the concept of a triangle, right?
Yeah, 3 sides, 3 angles.
Right. Now, imagine a chiliagon.
Oh, what a gun.
A chiliagon. It's a polygon with 1,000 sides.
1,000 sides. Okay, I can sort of grasp that conceptually.
Can you actually picture in your mind, like really see all 1,000 sides?
No, not really. I can barely picture a hexagon.
Exactly. But you can easily imagine a triangle, right?
Yeah, that's no problem.
So you can understand both a triangle and a chiliagon.
But picturing them is totally different.
And that's because imagination needs the body. It needs this kind of physical canvas that's linked to our senses.
So our imagination is actually limited by our physical brains.
That's what Descartes is getting at.
Okay, that's fascinating.
And that's one way he argues for the body's existence.
We needed to imagine.
Exactly.
Okay, so to recap, we started by doubting our senses, then we separated mind and body, and now we're seeing how the body is actually necessary for certain mental processes.
You got it.
It's all starting to connect.
It is. But here's where things get even more interesting.
Oh, there's more.
Oh, yeah. Descartes introduces another factor that influences how we perceive the world.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Our natural instincts.
You mean like our gut feelings and stuff?
Yeah, like those inherent inclinations that seem to guide our actions. Descartes calls this nature.
Nature.
It teaches us basic things, like seeking pleasure, avoiding pain.
Do survival stuff.
Exactly. But, and here's the twist,
Oh, there's always a twist with Descartes.
our instincts can be wrong.
Wait, seriously? But they're supposed to keep us safe, right?
They often do, but not always. He uses this really great analogy to explain it.
Okay, I love a good analogy. Hit me.
Imagine you're walking through a forest and you find a delicious-looking mushroom.
Oh, yeah, I've been there.
Your natural instinct might be to eat it, right?
Well, yeah, it looks delicious.
But it could be poisonous.
Oh, right. Nature can be tricky like that.
Exactly. It can be deceptive.
So our instincts, even though they're often helpful, they can't always be trusted when it comes to the physical world.
Precisely. And this whole idea of nature's trickery leads Descartes to an even bigger question.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What's the question?
If our senses ain't even our instincts can be flawed,
Right.
how can we ever be sure we're grasping the truth about reality?
Whoa. Yeah, that's a big one.
It is.
All right, well, I guess we'll have to wait until next time to find out how Descartes answers that one.
Yeah, it's a cliffhanger for sure.
But I'm already hooked. Can't wait to dive back in.
Me too. This is getting good. Welcome back.
All right, so last time, we ended on a pretty big cliffhanger.
Yeah, we did.
If we can't fully trust our senses or our instincts, how do we know, like, anything for sure?
Right. How can we be sure we're not just chasing shadows?
Exactly. There's got to be a way to ground ourselves, right?
For Descartes, the solution lies in the idea that even with these occasional deceptions, our experience generally points towards a world that makes sense. A coherent and ordered world.
Okay, so even though things can get a little fuzzy sometimes, there's still this underlying sense that the world, like, hangs together.
Exactly. It's not just chaos.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
And that's where Descartes brings in, you guessed it, God.
Of course, gotta have God in the mix.
It's Descartes, right. So he argues that because God is good and not a deceiver, he wouldn't have created us with senses that are inherently flawed or designed to mislead us.
Okay, so God's goodness is kind of like this safety net that ensures that our senses, even though they're imperfect, they can still lead us towards truth.
Exactly. But, and this is important, Descartes isn't saying we should just blindly trust our senses or rely on faith alone.
Right. There's got to be more to it than that.
There is. He emphasizes the importance of reason, using our God-given intellect to really sift through the information our senses are giving us.
So it's not just about what we perceive, but how we think about it.
Precisely. It's about using logic and critical thinking to arrive at true knowledge.
So it's this kind of three-pronged approach. Senses, reason, and the guarantee of God's goodness all working together.
You got it.
Okay, I think I'm following so far. But how does this actually play out when we're trying to understand the physical world?
Well, Descartes points out that there are certain aspects of material objects that we can grasp really clearly and distinctly.
Like what? Give me an example.
Think about the properties of things that can be measured, things that can be described mathematically.
Okay, so like shape, size, extension.
Exactly. Like, we can see that this table has 4 legs and a flat surface.
Right. Pretty straightforward.
Descartes calls these primary qualities.
Primary qualities.
And he argues that they're objective and real because we can conceive of them so clearly in our minds. And because, again, God wouldn't deceive us, these qualities must correspond to actual properties in the physical world.
Okay, that makes sense for things like squares and circles. But what about things like color or sound or taste? Those seem a lot more subjective, right?
That's a great point. And Descartes acknowledges this. He calls those secondary qualities.
Secondary qualities.
Yeah. And he argues that they're more dependent on our own subjective experience, not the object itself.
So, like, the redness of an apple isn't actually in the apple itself.
Right. It's more about how our minds perceive it.
It's the way the apple reflects light, and then our brains interpret that as red.
Exactly. So there's this interplay between the object and our perception.
And that's super interesting. It seems like this whole distinction between primary and secondary qualities is how Descartes really tries to differentiate between, like, what's truly out there in the world and what's just our own experience of it.
Exactly. It's his way of navigating between the subjective realm of our senses and the objective realm of, actual physical stuff.
Okay, so even though we can't be absolutely certain about all the details of the physical world,
right, we can never be 100% sure.
Descartes believes that our senses, when combined with reason, give us enough evidence to believe that it exists.
Yeah, that's the key.
We're not just living in a simulation.
Or a dream.
Right. But if we zoom out a bit, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how we go from these very abstract, like, mathematical properties to the concrete reality of the entire universe? How do we make that leap?
That's a big question, yeah. And one way Descartes tries to address it is by pointing out that even though our senses can be deceptive sometimes, they're generally pretty reliable
Reliable in what sense?
in giving us information about what's beneficial or harmful to our bodies.
Okay, like if I see a fire, I know not to touch it.
Exactly. It's hot, it'll burn you. And if our senses were constantly giving us false information,
Mm-hmm.
we wouldn't survive very long.
True, true. So our senses are kind of like this built-in warning system.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. They're designed to help us navigate the world and avoid danger.
Makes sense. But what about those times when our senses deceive us? Like those optical illusions we talked about or phantom limb pain?
Yeah.
How does Descartes explain those?
Well, he admits that there will always be some instances where our senses might mislead us.
It's bound to happen sometimes.
Right. But he argues that these instances are rare and that we can usually correct for them
How do we do that?
by using reason, by comparing our experiences with others, by looking for inconsistencies.
So it's about being cautious, not jumping to conclusions, but also not letting a few illusions totally derail our belief in the physical world.
Exactly. It's like being a detective. You gather the evidence, you weigh the possibilities, and you use your logic to arrive at the most plausible explanation.
That's a great analogy. I like that.
And there's another important point to make here. Descartes isn't just arguing for the existence of individual physical objects in isolation.
Okay, so there's a bigger picture.
There is. He's arguing for the existence of a whole, coherent, and ordered world.
Like the universe isn't just a bunch of random stuff floating around.
Right. He believes it operates according to natural laws, that there are underlying principles that govern how things work.
And that this order ultimately reflects God's wisdom and goodness.
Exactly. So there's this sense of a grand design, a purpose behind it all.
That's a pretty profound idea. It's like even in the midst of all this doubt and uncertainty, Descartes still finds this underlying order and meaning in the universe.
And this idea of an ordered and intelligible universe, it's one of the key legacies of his philosophy.
Really? How so?
It helped to pave the way for the scientific revolution. The idea that we can study the world, understand its laws, and even predict how things will behave.
Wow, so we can kind of thank Descartes for helping launch modern science.
In a way, yeah. It's a pretty big deal.
That's amazing. But even with all these insights, I'm guessing there are still some unanswered questions or loose ends in Descartes' thinking.
Oh, absolutely. There are always more questions to explore.
Like what? What kind of doubts are we talking about?
Well, think back to that analogy of the poisoned food. Descartes says God wouldn't create us with senses that are inherently deceptive, right?
Right.
But if that's the case, why do our senses sometimes lead us astray? Why do we make mistakes? Why are illusions even possible?
Yeah, that's a good point. If God is all-knowing and all good, why allow for the possibility of error at all?
Right. It seems like a bit of a contradiction.
It does, and it's something that philosophers have been debating for centuries.
Another question that Descartes kind of raises but doesn't fully answer is how exactly the mind and body interact.
Oh, right. He establishes they're distinct, but how they actually connect is still a mystery.
It is, and it's a mystery that continues to fascinate us today.
So Descartes gives us this really compelling case for believing in the physical world, but he also leaves us with some pretty tantalizing mysteries to ponder.
And that's part of what makes his philosophy so engaging.
I agree. It's not just about finding the right answers, it's about asking the right questions.
Exactly. The quest for understanding is just as important as the understanding itself.
Well said. So what are some of the key takeaways we should be thinking about as we move forward?
One thing that really stands out to me is Descartes' emphasis on reason and critical thinking.
Yeah, he's not just telling us to blindly trust our senses or follow tradition. He's saying we have to actively engage our minds, question our assumptions, use logic to arrive at truth.
It's like he's giving us this toolkit for navigating a world that's full of potential illusions and deceptions.
I love that analogy, the toolkit for critical thinking. That's super relevant, especially today when we're bombarded with so much information from all sides.
Absolutely. It's more important than ever to be able to discern what's true, what's false, what's reliable, what's not.
But I'm also wondering how much of his philosophy hinges on this idea of a benevolent God.
Oh, that's the big question, isn't it?
If we take God out of the equation, does the whole structure collapse?
Can human reasons stand on its own 2 feet, even without a divine guarantee?
Those are some heavy questions. I'm not sure I have the answers.
And that's okay. Descartes isn't giving us all the answers on a silver platter.
It's more about the journey than the destination.
Exactly. It's the act of questioning, of doubting, of seeking deeper understanding. That's what really drives intellectual growth and discovery.
Well, we've certainly done our fair share of questioning today. We've covered a lot of ground, from doubting our senses to the mind-body problem to the role of God in all of this.
And along the way, I think we've gained some valuable insights into how we perceive the world, the power of reason, and the challenges of figuring out what we can really know for sure.
My brain is definitely feeling a little full right now, but in a good way. It's like this deep dive has really stretched my thinking and given me a new appreciation for how complex these questions are.
And that complexity is what makes it so fascinating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, for our listeners who want to keep exploring these ideas, I highly recommend checking out Descartes' Sixth Meditation for yourselves.
Yeah, dive into the source material.
You might be surprised by how relevant and thought-provoking it still is today.
It's a real philosophical adventure.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe it'll spark some lively debates at your next dinner party.
Or maybe just some quiet reflection.
Either way, it's time well spent.
But for now, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
Just remember, the quest for knowledge never ends.
So true.
So keep those minds curious. Keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah, don't be afraid to challenge your assumptions.
And join us next time for another fascinating plunge into the depths of ideas.
Until then, happy exploring, everyone. We're back, and I'm still kind of stuck on that cliffhanger.
Yeah, the big one?
What happens to Descartes' argument, like if we take God out of the picture?
Does the whole system, fall apart?
Yeah, does it crumble?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And philosophers are still debating it today.
Before we get into that, though,
Sure.
I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
About how Descartes argued for this separation of mind and body.
Right, the mind-body distinction.
Okay, he didn't really explain how they interact, did he?
That's true. He didn't fully explain it.
So did he have any theories about that, like how they connect?
Well, he did.
Oh, he did. Okay.
Remember how we talked about the pineal gland?
Yeah, that tiny little thing in the brain.
It's shaped like a pine cone.
Yeah, it sounded kind of mysterious.
Well, back then, nobody knew what it did.
It just knew it was there.
Right. So Descartes speculated that this might be the point where, the soul, the mind,
Okay.
actually interfaces with the physical body,
Interesting.
like a point of connection.
Oh.
He imagined it as this kind of control center.
Like a command center.
Yeah, where the immaterial mind could exert influence over the material body.
So, like, the mind is the driver, the body is the car, and the pineal gland is the steering wheel.
That's a great analogy.
It's the thing that connects them.
Yeah. Of course, now we know the pineal gland mainly regulates sleep and hormones.
Science marches on.
But for Descartes, it was this blank slate.
A placeholder, almost.
Yeah, where he could try to explain this mind-body connection.
It's amazing how much our understanding can change over time.
It is. But even if he was wrong about the pineal gland specifically,
Right.
his focus on the brain being this key player in the mind-body relationship,
Yeah.
that was really insightful.
Way ahead of his time.
Totally. But I want to go back to that tension we were talking about before.
Okay.
The tension between God's goodness
Mhm.
and the fact that, well, sometimes our senses deceive us.
Yeah, like how can both of those things be true at the same time?
Right. If God is all good and all-knowing, why would he create a world where illusions and errors are even possible?
It feels like a paradox.
It does, doesn't it?
Eh.
So Descartes tries to offer a few possible explanations.
Okay, what does he say?
One is that the error doesn't come from the senses themselves,
Okay.
but from the judgments we make based on those senses.
So it's not that our eyes are lying to us, it's
Right.
that our minds are misinterpreting what we see.
That's the idea.
So it's like our senses provide the raw data, but it's up to our intellect to actually make sense of it.
To interpret it, yeah.
It's like that saying, it's not what you look at, it's what you see.
Exactly. And Descartes believes we can minimize those errors
Okay.
by, training our minds to reason logically,
Okay.
to question our assumptions.
Don't just take things at face value.
Right. Think critically.
That's good advice for any time period, but especially today, with so much information flying around.
It's more important than ever to be
So
discerning.
you filter out the noise.
Exactly. But this brings us back to that fundamental question.
The big one.
Does Descartes' whole system, his whole philosophy, rely on believing in God?
If we remove that, what happens? Can we still trust our senses? Can we still trust our reason?
Those are the tough questions.
You really are.
And maybe Descartes doesn't give us all the answers.
Right, he leaves some things open.
He does. But his real genius, I think, lies not just in the arguments he makes, but in the questions he provokes.
He gets us thinking.
Yeah, he pushes us to confront the limits of our knowledge, to think about the nature of reality, to never stop questioning.
So it's about the journey as much as the destination.
Exactly. It's about that constant striving to understand more, to dig deeper.
And I think we've done a lot of digging today.
We have?
We started with doubting our senses.
Right from the beginning.
Then we dove into the mind-body problem, explored imagination, those natural instincts.
And of course, the role of God in all of this.
My brain is definitely full, but in a good way. It's been a real mind-bending experience.
It has. And for those of you listening who want to keep going on this philosophical adventure,
Keep exploring.
I highly recommend checking out Descartes' sixth meditation for yourselves.
Yeah, read the source material, grapple with the ideas firsthand.
It's surprisingly relevant, even today.
A timeless classic.
But for now, we're going to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
Just remember, the quest for knowledge never ends.
It's an ongoing process.
So keep those minds curious, keep asking those tough questions
And join us next time.
for another deep dive into the world of ideas.
Until then, happy exploring, everyone.